Hello, I am Candy, the storybook lady, and we are here again, ready for our next reading of The Horse and His Boy. This is the third installment. And so, do you remember what has happened so far? Right? We have a young boy and a horse that. What's special about the horse? That's right, the horse can talk. So we have the young boy Shasta and his horse Bree. And what adventure are they currently on? Correct. They've actually, Bree has convinced Shasta to run away from home. Shasta found out his home is probably not actually his home, and so he's gonna go find out where he's really from. And along the way, as they started their journey running away, what happened? Yeah, right. So they ran into another girl and her horse, and what's that? Yes, her horse can talk too. So they ran into Hwin, the female horse, and Aravis, and so she too is running away, right? So she told her story last time, and so now they've kind of decided to join forces because they're all headed to Narnia, and so they're gonna go on the journey together now. Where are they at right now? Yes, they are right outside the city called Tashbane, and they have to figure out how to kind of get through unseen and without a lot of drama and get to the other side. So they kind of have some decoys going on, and they're going to do their best to get through. So we got to find out tonight, hopefully, what happens and if they can get through the town. So let's get started. At first, Shasta could see nothing in the valley below him, but a sea of mist with a few domes and pinnacles rising from it. But as the light increased and the mist cleared away, he saw more and more. A broad river divided itself into two streams, and on the island between them stood the city of Tashbane, one of the wonders of the world. Round the very edge of the island, so that the water lapped against the stone, ran high walls strengthened with so many towers that he soon gave up trying to count them all. Inside the walls, the island rose in a hill, and every bit of that hill, up to the Tisrock's palace and the great temple of Tash at the top, was completely covered with buildings. Terrace above terrace, street above street, zigzag roads or huge flights of steps bordered with orange trees and lemon trees, roof gardens, balconies, deep archways, pillared colonnades, spires, battlements, minarets, pinnacles. And when at last the sun rose out of the sea and the great silver-plated dome of the temple flashed back its light, he was almost dazzled. "Get on, Shasta," Bree kept saying. The river banks on either side of the valley were such a mass of gardens that they looked at first like forest, until you got closer and saw the white walls of innumerable houses peeping out from beneath the trees. Soon after that, Shasta noticed a delicious smell of flowers and fruit. About 15 minutes later, they were down among them, plodding on a level road with white walls on each side and trees bending over the walls. "I say," said Shasta in an odd voice, "this is a wonderful place." "I dare say," said Bree, "but I wish we were safely through it and out on the other side. Narnia and the North." At that moment, a low throbbing noise began, which gradually swelled louder and louder, till the whole valley seemed to be swaying with it. It was a musical noise, but not so strong and solemn as to be a little frightening. "That's the horns blowing for the city gates to be opened," said Bree. "We shall be there in a minute. Now, Arvis, do droop your shoulders a bit and step heavier and try to look less like a princess. Try to imagine you've been kicked and cuffed and called names all your life." "If it comes to that," said Arvis, "what about you drooping your head a bit and arcing your neck a bit less and trying to look less like a war horse?" "Hush," said Bree. "Here we are." And they were. They had come to the river's edge, and the road ahead of them ran along a mini arched bridge. The water danced brightly in the early sunlight. Away to their right, near the river's mouth, they caught a glimpse of the ship's mast. Several other travelers were before them on the bridge, mostly peasants driving laden donkeys and mules or carrying baskets on their heads. The children and horses joined the crowd. "Is there anything wrong?" whispered Shasta to Arvis, who had an odd look on her face. "Oh, it's all very well for you," whispered Arvis rather savagely. "What would you care about Tashbaan? But I ought to be riding in on a litter with soldiers before me and slaves behind, and perhaps going to a feast at the Tisroc's palace. May he live forever. Not sneaking in like this. It's different for you." Shasta thought all this very silly. At the far end of the bridge, the walls of the city towered high above them, and the brazen gates stood open in the gateway, which was really wide but looked narrow because it was so very high. Half a dozen soldiers, leaning on their spears, stood on each side. Arvis couldn't help thinking, "They'd all jump to attention and salute me if they knew whose daughter I am." But the others were only thinking of how they'd get through, hoping the soldiers wouldn't ask any questions. Fortunately, they did not. But one of them picked a carrot out of a peasant's basket and threw it at Shasta with a rough laugh, saying, "Hey, horse boy, you'll catch it if your master finds you've been using his saddle horse for pack work." This frightened him badly, for of course it showed that no one who knew anything about horses would mistake Bree for anything but a charger. "It's my master's orders, so there," said Shasta. But it would have been better if he had held his tongue, for the soldier gave him a box on the side of his face and nearly knocked him down and said, "Take that, you young filth, to teach you how to talk to freemen." But they all slunk into the city without being stopped. Shasta cried only a very little. He was used to hard knocks. Inside the gates, Tashbaan did not at first seem so splendid as it looked from the distance. The first street was narrow, and there were hardly any windows in the walls on each side. It was much more crowded than Shasta had expected. Crowded partly by the peasants on their way to the market, who had come in with them, but also with water sellers, sweetmeat sellers, porters, soldiers, beggars, ragged children, hens, stray dogs, and barefooted slaves. What you would chiefly have noticed if you had been there was the smells, which came from unwashed people. Unwashed dogs, scent, garlic, onions, and the piles of refuse which lay everywhere. Shasta was pretending to lead, but it was really Bree who knew the way and kept guiding him by little nudges with his nose. They soon turned to the left and began going up a steep hill. It was much fresher and pleasanter, for the road was bordered by trees and there were houses only on the right side. On the other, they looked out over the roofs of the houses in the lower town and could see some way up the river. Then they went round a hairpin bend into the right and continued rising. They were zigzagging up the center of Tashbaan. Soon they came to finer streets. Great statues of the gods and heroes of Calormen, who are mostly impressive rather than agreeable to look at, rose on shining pedestals. Palm trees and pillared arcades cast shadows over the burning pavements, and through the arched gateways of many a palace, Shasta caught sight of green branches, cool fountains, and smooth lawns. It must be nice inside, he thought. At every turn, Shasta hoped they were getting out of the crowd, but they never did. This made their progress very slow, and every now and then they had to stop altogether. This usually happened because a loud voice shouted, "Way, way, way for the Tarkin," or "for the Tarkina," or "for the 50th Vizier," or "for the ambassador," and everyone in the crowd would crush back against the walls, and above their heads Shasta would sometimes see the great lord or lady for whom all the fuss was being made, lolling up a litter which 4 or even 6 gigantic slaves carried on their bare shoulders. For in Tashbaan, there is only one traffic regulation, which is that everyone who is less important has to get out of the way for everyone who is more important, unless you want a cut from a whip or a punch from the butt end of a spear. It was in a splendid street very near the top of the city, the Tisroc's palace was the only thing above it, that the most disastrous of these stoppages occurred. "Way, way, way," came the voice. "Way for the white barbarian king, the guest of the Tisroc, may he live forever. Way of the Narnian lords." Shasta tried to get out of the way and to make Bree go back, but no horse, not even a talking horse from Narnia, backs easily. And a woman with a very edgy basket in her hands, who was just behind Shasta, pushed the basket hard against his shoulders and said, "Now then, who are you shoving?" And then someone else jostled him from the side, and in the confusion of the moment, he lost hold of Bree. And then the whole crowd behind him became so stiffened and packed tight that he couldn't move at all. So he found himself, unintentionally, in the first row and had a fine sight of the party that was coming down the street. It was quite unlike any other party they had seen that day. The crier who went before it, shouting, "Way, way," was the only Calormene in it. And there was no litter. Everyone was on foot. There were about 6 men, and Shasta had never seen anyone like them before. For one thing, they were all as fair-skinned as himself, and most of them had fair hair. And they were not dressed like men of Calormen. Most of them had legs bare to the knee. Their tunics were of fine, bright, hardy colors, woodland green or gay yellow or fresh blue. Instead of turbans, they wore steel or silver caps, and some of them set with jewels, and one with little wings on each side. A few were bareheaded. The swords at their sides were long and straight, not curved like the Calormene scimitars. And instead of being grave and mysterious like most Calormenes, they walked with a swing and let their arms and shoulders go free, and chatted and laughed. One was whistling. You could see that they were ready to be friends with anyone who was friendly and didn't give a fig for anyone who wasn't. Shasta thought he had never seen anything so lovely in his life. But there was not time to enjoy it, for at once a really dreadful thing happened. The leader of the fair-headed men suddenly pointed at Shasta, cried out, "There he is! There's our runaway!" and seized him by the shoulder. Next moment he gave Shasta a smack. Not a cruel one to make you cry, but a sharp one to let you know you were in disgrace. And added, shaking, "Shame on you, my lord. Fie for shame. Queen Susan's eyes are red with weeping because of you. What? Truant for a whole night? Where have you been?" Shasta would have darted under Bree's body and tried to make himself scarce in the crowd if he had had the least chance, but the fair-haired men were all around him by now, and he was held firm. Of course, his first impulse was to say that he was only poor Arshish, the fisherman's son, and that the foreign lord must have mistaken him for somebody else. But then, the very last thing he wanted to do in that crowded place was to start explaining who he was and what he was doing. If he started on that, he would soon be asked where he had got his horse from, and who Aravis was, and then goodbye to any chance of getting through Tashbaan. His next impulse was to look at Bree for help, but Bree had no intention of letting all that crowd know that he could talk, and he stood there, looking just as stupid as a horse can. As for Aravis, Shasta didn't even dare to look for her for fear of drawing attention, and there was no time to think, for the leader of the Narnians said at once, "Take one of his lordship's hands, Peridin, of your courtesy, and I'll take the other. And now on. Our royal sister's mind will be greatly eased when she sees our young scapegrace safe in our lodging." And so, before they were halfway through Tashbane, all their plans were ruined, and without even a chance to say goodbye to the others, Shasta found himself being marched off among strangers and quite unable to guess what might be going to happen next. The Narnian king, for Shasta began to see by the way the rest spoke to him that he must be a king, kept on asking him questions. Where had he been? How had he got out? What had he done with his clothes, and didn't he know that he had been very naughty? Only the king called it naught instead of naughty. And Shasta said nothing in answer because he couldn't think of anything to say that would not be dangerous. "What? Oh, Mum," asked the king, "I must plainly tell you, Prince, that this hand-dogged silence becomes one of your blood even less than escape itself. To run away might pass for a boy's frolic with some spirit in it, but the king's son of Archenland should avouch his deed, not hang his head like a Kellerman slave." This was very unpleasant, for Shasta felt all the time that this young king was the very nicest kind of grown-up and would have liked to make a good impression on him. The strangers led him, held tightly by both hands, along a narrow street and down a flight of shallow stairs, and then up another to a wide doorway in a white wall with two tall, dark cypress trees, one on each side of it. Once through the arch, Shasta found himself in a courtyard, which was also a garden. A marble basin of clear water in the center was kept continually rippling by the fountain that fell into it. Orange trees grew round it out of smooth grass, and 4 white walls which surrounded the lawn were covered with climbing roses. The noise and dust and crowding of the streets seemed suddenly far away. He was led rapidly across the garden and then into a dark doorway. The crier remained outside. After that they took him along a corridor where the stone floor felt beautifully cool to his hot feet, and up some stairs. A moment later he found himself blinking in the light of a big airy room with wide open doors all looking north, so that no sun came in. There was a carpet on the floor, more wonderfully colored than anything he had ever seen, and his feet sank down into it as if he were treading in thick moss. All round the walls there were low sofas with rich cushions on them, and the room seemed to be full of people. Very queer, some of them, thought Shasta, but he had no time to think of that before the most beautiful lady he had ever seen rose from her place and threw her arms round him and kissed him, saying, "Oh, Corin, Corin, how could you? And thou and I such close friends ever since thy mother died. And what should I have said to thy royal father if I came home without thee? Would have been it a cause almost of war between Archenland and Narnia, which are friends time out of mind. It was not, playmate, very naught of thee to use us so." Apparently, thought Shasta to himself, I'm being mistaken for a prince of Archenland, wherever that is, and these must be Narnians. I wonder where the real Corin is. But these thoughts did not help him say anything out loud. "Where hast thou been, Corin?" said the lady, her hand still on Shasta's shoulders. I don't know," stammered Shasta. "There it is, Susan," said the king. "I could get no tale out of him, true or false." "Your Majesties, Queen Susan, King Edmund," said a voice, and when Shasta turned to look at the speaker he nearly jumped out of his skin with surprise, for it was one of those queer people whom he had noticed out of the corner of his eye when he first came into the room. He was about the same height as Shasta himself. From the waist upward he was like a man, but his legs were hairy like a goat's, and shaped like a goat's, and he had a goat's hooves and a tail. His skin was rather red, and he had curly hair and short pointed beard and 2 little horns. He was, in fact, a faun, which is a creature Shasta had never seen a picture of or even heard of. And if you've read a book called The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you may like to know that this was the very same Faun Tumnus by name, whom Queen Susan's sister Lucy had met on the very first day when she found her way into Narnia. But he was a good deal older now, for by this time Peter and Susan and Edmund and Lucy had been kings and queens of Narnia for several years. "Your Majesties," he was saying, "His little Highness has had a touch of the sun. Look at him. He is dazed. He does not know where he is." Then, of course, everyone stopped scolding Shasta and asking him questions, and he was made much of and laid on a sofa, and cushions were put under his head, and he was given iced sherbet in a golden cup to drink and told to keep very quiet. Nothing like this had ever happened to Shasta in his life before. He had never even imagined lying on anything so comfortable as that sofa, or drinking anything so delicious as that sherbet. He was still wondering what had happened to the others and how on earth he was going to escape and meet them at the tombs, and what would happen when the real corn turned up again. But none of these worries seemed so pressing now that he was comfortable. And perhaps later on there would be nice things to eat. Meanwhile, the people in the cool, airy room were very interesting. Besides the faun, there were 2 dwarfs, a kind of creature he had never seen before, and a very large raven. The rest were all humans, grown-ups, but young. And all of them, both men and women, had nicer faces and voices than most Calormens. And soon Shasta found himself taking an interest in the conversation. "Now, madam," the king was saying to Queen Susan, the lady who had kissed Shasta, "what think you? We have been in the city fully 3 weeks. Have you yet settled in your mind whether you will marry this dark-faced lover of yours, this Prince Rabadash, or no?" The lady shook her head. "No, brother," she said, "not for all the jewels in Tashbane." Hello, thought Shasta. Although they're king and queen, they're brother and sister, not married to one another. "Truly, sister," said the king, "I should have loved you less if you had taken him. And I tell you that at the first coming of the Tisrock's ambassadors into Narnia to treat of this marriage, and later when the prince was our guest at Cair Paravel, it was a wonder to me that you could ever find it in your heart to show him so much favor." "That was my folly, Edmund," said Queen Susan, "of which I cry your mercy. Yet when he was with us in Narnia, truly this prince bore himself in another fashion than he does now in Tashbane. For I take you all to witness what marvelous feats he did in the great tournament and hostilode, when our brother the High King made for him, and how meekly and courteously he consorted with us the space of 7 days. But here, in his own city, he has shown another face." "Ah," croaked the raven, "it is an old saying, 'See the bear in his own den before you judge of his conditions.'" "That's very true, Salopad," said one of the dwarves. "And another is, 'Come live with me, and you'll know me.'" "Yes," said the king, "we have now seen him for what he is. That is, a most proud, bloody, luxurious, cruel, and self-pleasing tyrant." "Then, in the name of Aslan," said Susan, "let us leave Tashbane this very day." "There's the rub, sister," said Edmund. "For now I must open to you all that has been growing in my mind these last 2 days and more. Pridian, of your courtesy, look to the door, and see that there is no spy among us. All well? So, for now, we must be secret." Everyone had begun to look very serious. Queen Susan jumped up and ran to her brother. "Oh, Edmund," she cried, "what is it? There is something dreadful in your face." Chapter 5, Prince Corin. "My dear sister and very good lady," said King Edmund, You must now show your courage, for I plainly tell you, we are in no small danger." "What is it, Edmund?" asked the queen. "It is this," said Edmund. "I do not think we shall find it easy to leave Tashbane. While the prince had hoped that you would take him, we were honored guests. But by the lion's mane, I think that as soon as he has your flat denial, we shall be no better than prisoners." One of the dwarfs gave a low whistle. "I warned your majesties, I warned you," said Salopad the raven. "Easily in, but not easily out, as the lobster said in the lobster pot." "I have been with the prince this morning," continued Edmund. "He is little used, more's the pity, to having his will crossed, and he is very chafed at your long delays and doubtful answers. This morning he pressed very hard to know your mind. I put it aside, meaning at the same time to diminish his hopes, with some light common jest about women's fancies, and hinted that his suit was likely to be cold. He grew angry and dangerous. There was a sort of threatening, though still veiled under a show of courtesy, in every word he spoke." "Yes," said Tumnus, "and when I supped with the Grand Vizier last night, it was the same. He asked me how I liked Tashbane, and I, for I could not tell him I hated every stone of it, and I would not lie, told him that now, when high summer was coming in, my heart turned to the cool woods and the dewy slopes of Narnia. He gave a smile that meant no good, and said, 'There is nothing to hinder you from dancing there again, little goatfoot, always provided you leave us in exchange a bride for our prince.'" "Do you mean that he would make me his wife by force?" exclaimed Susan. "That's my fear, Susan," said Edmund. "Wife or slave, which is worse?" "But how can he? Does the Tisroc think our brother, the High King, would suffer such an outrage?" "Sire," said the Parian to the king, "they would not be so mad. Do they think there are no swords and spears in Narnia?" "Alas," said Edmund, "my guess is the Tisroc has very small fear of Narnia. We are a little land, and little lands on the borders of great empire were always hateful to the lords of the great empire. He longs to blot them out, gobble them up. When first he suffered the prince to come to Cair Paravel as your lover, sister, it may be that he was only seeking an occasion against us. Most likely he hopes to make one mouthful of Narnia and Archland both." "Let him try," said the second dwarf. "At sea we are as big as he is, and if he assaults us by land, he has the desert to cross." "True, friend," said Edmund, "but is the desert a sure defense? What does Salopad say?" "I know that desert well," said the raven, "for I have flown above it far and wide in my younger days." You might be sure that Shasta picked up his ears at this point. "And this is certain, that if the Tisroc goes by the great oasis, he can never lead a great army across it into Archland. For though they could reach the oasis by the end of their first day's march, yet the springs there would be too little for the thirst of all those soldiers and their beasts. But there is another way." Shasta listened more attentively still. "He would find that way," said the raven. "Must start from the tombs of the ancient kings and ride northwest, so that the double peak of the Mount Pyre is always straight ahead of him. And so, in a day's riding or a little more, he shall come to the head of a stony valley, which is so narrow that a man might be within a furlong of it to 1,000 times and never know that it was there. And looking down this valley, he will see neither grass nor water nor anything else good. But if he rides on down it, he will come to a river and can ride by that water all the way into Archenland." "And do the Calormenes know of this western way?" asked the queen. Friends," said Edmund, "what is the use of all this discourse? We are not asking whether Narnia or Calormen would win if a war arose between them. We are asking how to save the honor of the Queen and our own lives out of this devilish city. For though my brother, Peter the High King, defeated the Tisroc 12 times over, yet long before that day our throats would be cut, and the Queen's Grace would be the wife, or more likely, the slave of this prince. We have our weapons, King, said the first dwarf, and this is reasonably defensible house. As to that, said the king, I do not doubt that every one of us would sell our lives dearly in the gate, and they would not come at the queen but over our dead bodies. Yet we should be merely rats fighting in a trap when all's said. Very true, croaked the raven. These last stands in a house make good stories, but nothing ever came of them. And their first repulses, the enemy always set the house on fire. I am the cause of all of this, said Susan, bursting into tears. Oh, if I had only never left Cair Paravel. Our last happy days was before those ambassadors came from the Calormen. The moles were planting an orchard for us, and oh, and she buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Courage, Sue, courage, said Edmund. Remember, but what is the matter with you, Master Tumnus? For the fawn was holding both his horns with his hands as if he were trying to keep his head on them by writhing them to and fro as if he had pain in his inside. Don't speak to me, said Tumnus. I'm thinking so that I can hardly breathe. Wait, do wait. There was a moment's puzzled silence, and then the fawn looked up, drew a long breath, mopped his forehead, and said, The only difficulty is how to get down to our ship with some stores too, without being seen and stopped. Yes, said the dwarf dryly. Just as the beggar's only difficulty about riding is that he has no horse. Wait, said Mr. Tumnus impatiently. All we need is some pretext for going down to our ship today and taking stuff on board. Yes, said King Edmund doubtfully. Well then, said the fawn, how would it be if your majesties bade the prince to a great banquet to be held on board to allow our own Galilean, the Splendor Hyaline, tomorrow night? And let the message be worded as graciously as the queen can contrive without pledging her honor, so as to give the prince a hope that she is weakening. This is very good counsel, sire, croaked the raven. And then, continued Tumnus sadly, everyone will expect us to be going down to the ship all day, making preparations for our guest, and let some of us go to the bazaars and spend every minimum we have at the fruiterers and the sweetmeat sellers and the wine merchants, just as if we were really giving a feast. And let us order magicians and jugglers and dancing girls and flute players, all to be on board tomorrow night. I see, said King Edmund, rubbing his hands. And then, said Tumnus, we'll all be on board tonight. And as soon as it's quite dark, up sails and out oars, said the king. And so to the sea, cried Tumnus, leaping up and beginning to dance. And our nose northward, said the first dwarf. Running for home! Hurrah for Narnia in the north, said the other. And the prince waking to next morning, finding his birds flown, said the Prudian, clapping his hands. Oh, Master Tumnus, dear Master Tumnus, said the queen, catching his hands and swinging him as he danced. You have saved us all. But the prince will chase us, said another lord, whose name Shasta had not heard. That's the least of my fears, said Edmund. I have seen all the shipping in the river, and there's no tall ship of war, nor swift galley there. I wish he may chase us, for the Splendor Hyaline could sink anything he has to send after her, if we were overtaken at all." "Sire," said the raven, "you shall hear no better plot than the fawn's, though we sat in council for 7 days. And now, as we birds say, nest before eggs, which is as much to say, let us all take our food, and then at once be about our business." Everyone arose at this, and the doors were opened, and the lords and the creatures stood aside for the king and queen to go out first. Shasta wondered what he ought to do, but Mr. Tumnus said, "Lie there, your highness, and I will bring you up a little feast to yourself in a few moments. There's no need for you to move until we are all ready to embark." Shasta laid his head down again on the pillows, and soon he was alone in the room. "Oh, this is perfectly dreadful," thought Shasta. It never came into his head to tell these Narnias the whole truth and ask for their help. Having been brought up by a hard, close-fisted man like Arshish, he had a fixed habit of never telling grown-ups anything if he could help it. He thought they would always spoil or stop whatever you were trying to do, and he thought that even if the Narnian king might be friendly to the two horses because they were talking beasts of Narnia, he would hate Aravis because she was a Calormene, and either sell her for a slave or send her back to her father. And for himself, "I simply daren't tell them I'm not Prince Corin now," said Shasta. "I've heard all their plans. If they knew I wasn't one of themselves, they'd never let me out of this house alive. They'd be afraid I'd betray them to the Tisroc. They'd kill me. And if the real Corin turns up, it'll all come out. And they will." He had, you see, no idea of how noble freeborn people behave. "What am I to do? What am I to do?" he kept saying to himself. "Well, hello, comes that goaty little creature again. And we will stop right there for tonight. Oh my, so it doesn't look like they got through the town at all. They got split up pretty quickly. We see Shasta's here with the King and Queen of Narnia. You remember them from the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So we have Edmund and Susan. And remember Lucy and Peter, they must still be in Narnia. So he's met up with them, so that's interesting. But he's kind of in a pickle, and we certainly don't know where Bree or Hwin or Aravis are and what's going on with them and how will they meet up. So this is quite a big problem. So we come back next week so we can find out how Shasta hooks back up with his team and the horses, and to see how even Queen Susan's going to get away from this guy who sounds like he's a real bad guy. So sounds good. See you next week. Thanks for tuning in.